the child never chooses the parent. The child comes into the world because the parent chose them. The child from the beginning has absolutely no power and no autonomy over themselves or their life. They are completely dependent on their parents for love, for care, for the resources that they need, for their education, for their clothes, for the roof over their head, for food, all of it. So there is a massive imbalance of power there. Some parents, unfortunately, to one degree or another, exploit this power imbalance for themselves. All right, today we are going to be doing something a little bit different. I have a question that I've gotten from one of my viewers here, and I'm going to be reading out that question and trying to answer it the best that I can. The question I got from my viewer is this: how does someone's poor mental state affect the people around them, and how can those people cope with it? Now, throughout the rest of this video, we're going to do a couple of different things. The structure is going to run like this. First, I'm going to talk about this question in relationship to voluntary relationships. Insofar that as you have chosen to be in a relationship with somebody, either friends or family or romantic relationships, how do you go about coping with it, and how can this person's mental state affect you? But I'm also going to talk about involuntary relationships, specifically the child to parent relationship, in which children are in an unchosen relationship with their parents but are still dependent on them. This is sort of a unique situation in which different dangers kind of come up and different coping mechanisms are required. For each of these kinds of relationships, I'm going to talk about the main dangers that are involved with the other person's poor mental state, as well as strategies to cope with the poor mental state within these relationships. And as regards of voluntary relationships, I'm going to talk about two special cases, those being marriage and the parent to child relationship. That is, the parent's responsibility to the child when the child is suffering with poor mental health. And in fact, that last relationship is going to serve as a mirror when we talk about the involuntary relationships for the child in relationship to the parent. So the first kind of relationship that we're going to get into is voluntary relationships. Now, what's the main danger here in voluntary relationships when the person you're around, whether it's a friend, whether it's family, whether it's a partner, has a poor mental state? How does this affect you, and how are some ways that you can deal with this? Well, there are a lot of different issues that can go on, but the main issue that we're going to talk about here is what I call emotional reproduction. And essentially, this is a situation in which the person's mental state, a poor mental state, whether that's anxiety or depression or anger, these kinds of emotions can essentially bleed on to you, on the person who's around them frequently. And this happens for a number of different reasons, specifically three that I can think of, each of which are worth mentioning. The first and probably the most general is the idea of social mirroring. So this is sort of the idea that the people who you are around, their emotional states, you are going to end up reflecting their emotional states the more that you're around them. You sort of end up being a reflection emotionally of the people that you hang out with. If you hang out with a lot of people who are anxious and depressed and dealing with a lot of poor mental health issues, there's a danger that you are going to end up reflecting this in yourself. And the principal mechanism psychologically for this is that your brain is constantly trying to understand its environment and sort of what's going wrong and what you need to do in response to that environment. And so if your brain picks up that a lot of the people around you, or the people that you're around most often, are displaying different emotional signs like anxiety and depression and anger or what have you, your brain is essentially going to think, well, there must be something about this environment that is depressing, that is worthy to be anxious about, worthy to be angry about, worthy to be fearful of, and it will try to reproduce that same kind of emotion in you, meaning that you can subtly become more anxious, more depressed, more angry yourself, just as a result of the social environment that you have put yourself in. But this is not the only kind of emotional reproduction that can happen. The second would be the risk of personal trauma repetition. So if you've had certain childhood experiences in which maybe your parents, for example, were anxious or depressed or angry, and in one way or another this affected you, either directly in that they gave you the burden of their anxiety and depression and anger, maybe they yelled at you, maybe you had to walk on eggshells around them because you didn't know if what you said would spiral them into greater depression or greater anxiety. That kind of emotional environment as a child can make you in some ways hyper aware of those same kinds of emotions in other people and give you a disproportionate response to it. Meaning that as a child, when your parents was anxious, you really didn't have any choice to be around them. You sort of just had to deal with them and had to deal with the negative consequences of whatever mental state that they were going through. And so when you end up around somebody who is struggling with these things as an adult, you can kind of have that same feeling of being trapped, of being in a position where you feel as though you need or you have to care for this person or sort of fix them. There is a danger there of repeating the childhood circumstance as an adult, even though the situations are very different, especially along the lines of choice. And if you are not aware that that is going on, that kind of childhood trauma repetition is happening, you can get easily sucked into a personal need to sort of fix the person or to relate to them by, again, repeating the same kinds of emotions that they are having and sort of validating them through your own emotional behavior as a displaced way of either getting love and affection or else trying to protect yourself from another person. In fact, just daily normal emotions can kind of trigger this same childhood response where maybe some sort of normal anxiety from your partner or your friend can trigger an over exaggerated sense of anger or frustration in yourself because you feel in one sense trapped by their emotions in the same way that you really were trapped as a child. So the personal trauma repetition as a result of constantly being around somebody who is going through a poor mental state that is reflective of your own childhood state can become a real problem, especially if you're not aware of it. And the last danger in this realm of emotional reproduction is the sense of projection, which can be conscious or unconscious. There's that classic saying that misery loves company. And there may be a sense in which the person that you're around may either consciously or subconsciously try to reproduce these emotions into you by projecting onto you what they themselves are feeling, especially by constantly insisting that you're around them. So one example of this would be depression, for example. If you were around somebody who is chronically depressed, whether they are doing it consciously or subconsciously, sometimes a circumstance can arise where, let's say you're a friend with somebody who is suffering from depression, and you do what you can to try and to help this person, right? You try to get them to go outside. Maybe you try to encourage them to do whatever, to go seek therapy, to journal, to exercise. You sit and you talk with them, and it seems that no matter what you do or no matter what you try, you can't really get this person out of their depression, which can feel incredibly frustrating, but it can also end up feeling hopeless, right? You start to feel as though nothing that you're doing in relationship to this person is really working. And you yourself start to become depressed about your ability to kind of help this person. There is, again, that emotional reproduction that happens just in that relationship with that person. And it may be the case, I'm not saying this is always the case, but it may be the case that the person, especially subconsciously, is reacting negatively to your attempts to help in order to reproduce their own depression in you as a way of validating their own experiences of depression. They want to believe that their depression is real response to their present circumstances, and part of the way they validate this is by reproducing those emotions in the people around you. Another example of this that you could consider would be something like anger. Oftentimes, if you're around a person who is very angry and they're yelling at you, or they have these kinds of outbursts, or they're threatening, it can be very shocking and fearful. And a natural response to threat is anger itself. And so you can easily end up reproducing in yourself a degree of anger towards that person or anger towards other people in your life because you are constantly around a person who is angry. And so again, the real danger and being around somebody, the real way that somebody's poor mental state affects you is that it can reproduce the same kinds of emotions and the same kinds of problems and the same kinds of triggers that the person themselves is struggling with, which can, of course, bleed into your own personal life and can make it difficult to be around the person or to help that person if helping them is your goal. So, considering that this is the main danger in being around the person who is going through some mental struggles, let's say, what kind of things can you do to cope with a situation like that in a voluntary context, meaning that you are choosing to be around this person to one degree or another? And I would say that the first thing that you want to try to recognize in a situation like this is your choice and your autonomy. If it's a relationship like a partner or a friend or even being around a family member, there is a degree of power and control that you have in being around that person. And even just being aware of that fact can give you a little distance from what's happening, because oftentimes in a situation like that, you can begin to feel enmeshed and feel trapped. Again, you can kind of produce those childhood trauma responses, or you can start to feel enveloped by this person's emotions and by their emotional state. And just from the beginning, recognizing that you have a choice whether or not to be around this person, that you have autonomy and control in terms of how you're going to react, how you're going to behave, whether you're going to continue the relationship or not, even if you don't take any action whatsoever in terms of, distancing yourself in the relationship, just recognizing the fact that you have that autonomy and control can be quite liberating and give you a little bit of distance and ease a little bit of the frustration that can come from this emotional reproduction. And in the same kind of vein, keeping it in the back of your head that you can distance from a person if necessary. You can forthrightly tell somebody who is going through an emotional state, a poor emotional state, and you're really, let's say you're really frustrated, you're really caught up with it, maybe something's going on for you, you're really struggling with something. You are completely within your rights to express to this person the struggles that you're going through in a simple way, not to necessarily burden them with that, but in a simple way, and say, hey, I need some time to distance myself, to do a little self-care. We'll get into that here in a second. And I can come back, in a little while, right? Whether that's an hour, whether that's a couple of days, whether that's a week, whether that's a month in some extreme circumstances, that is an option that you have. It's part of your autonomy and choice within any given voluntary relationship. Recognizing again that you have that kind of power can be very liberating within the situation itself and give you a little bit of distance when you need it. This is not to say that when the relationship becomes difficult or when it's hard to be around a person who's going through mental health issues, that your first snap instinct should be to sort of cut off the relationship. I see this a lot in more modern attitudes to relationship. I think it has a place, especially in abusive relationships or in incredibly toxic personal and parental relationships, which we'll get into a little bit later. But in sort of run-of-the-mill relationships where it becomes difficult and you're sort of having a frazzled time, I think people too often take this route of, well, I'm just not going to interact with this person, right? Like maybe they have ideas I disagree with. Maybe they're going through something that is in one sense difficult for me to deal with, and their instinct is sort of just to cut off the relationship. And it doesn't mean that you have to subject yourself to that relationship with that person. It doesn't mean you have to subject that yourself to that person's whatever that person is going through. But there's sort of a middle of the road process here where you're forthright with this person and you say, hey, being around you is difficult for me. Right. So you're not blaming them for it. You're not telling them you're causing me these kinds of problems, because that's not the truth of what's going on. You're simply saying, hey, being around you sometimes is really difficult for me in X, Y, and Z way. And I need some time, I need some space, I need some distance in order to sort of recoup myself and figure out, you might say, the best way to proceed. I need some time to deal with my own emotions that are coming up around this circumstance, right? Around you, around this person, right? And that is a perfectly valid thing for you to say to somebody, something which you are completely within your rights to do in any of these kinds of relationships. And so, recognize that option, right? Recognize that you have choice, that you have autonomy, that you can distance if need be, and you can be honest with the person about distancing, and that you don't have to necessarily, endure it and suffer it. And you also don't necessarily have to just permanently cut off somebody from your life just because they're going through a difficult time or they're caught up in something. There is a middle of the road path in terms of relationships where you're not burning bridges, but you're also not being consumed by the poor mental health of somebody else. Now, both of these things require a certain amount of emotional self-awareness. And self-awareness is another one of those things which I think is crucial to coping in a situation like this. You have to be willing to recognize, okay, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I struggling with? Sometimes when somebody is struggling with, mental health issues or a poor mental state, you can get so caught up in being focused on them and what they're going through and what they're suffering. But it's really important to be aware of your own emotional mental state, your own feelings, what you're going through, and whether or not you need the distance, right? Whether or not you need some self-care, whether or not this is a good situation for you, whether or not this is something, you'd like to tolerate. And so enveloping all the things that we're talking about is this need for your own self-awareness, like checking in with yourself, checking in with your emotions at the end of the day, checking in, man, how did it feel to be around this person or to be in this circumstance? Was it good? Was it bad? Was it difficult? Was it easy? Did I feel trapped? Is something from my past coming up? Considering these kinds of questions, considering your thoughts and emotions, and taking those thoughts and emotions seriously is going to be able to give you a better grasp on what you might need to do in regards to that situation. Of course, a lot of these situations are subjective, and I'm just presenting general guidelines here, but self-awareness is definitely one. One that comes to mind is the idea of demarcating responsibility, right? So somebody who's going through in a difficult emotional state, sometimes I think we end up taking, we have compassion for this person. Maybe we really value the relationship. We want to be around them. And in one sense or another, we take responsibility for their emotional state, right? And we try everything that we can to sort of help them or fix them instead of recognizing that on some level, their emotions are their responsibility in the sense that they have to take the active steps to actually move beyond whatever issue that they're dealing with, right? And if they aren't an active participator in their own overcoming, so to speak, that is something that you need to give them ownership of, not necessarily directly to them, but just mentally tag it in their head, essentially saying, this person's emotions are their emotions. They're their responsibility. And in the same way, because this cuts both ways, you have to recognize that your own emotions are your responsibility. If you're in a situation like this and you are really caught up in this person's mental states, you're feeling all kinds of anger and anxiety and depression around them, you're in a toxic situation like that, taking responsibility for the fact that you have chosen to be in this situation and you can leave is crucial in giving you, again, that sense of autonomy over the situation. If you don't have a choice, right? If you're not in control of your emotions, then you can do nothing about your emotions. But if you recognize that you do have a choice, if you recognize that you are responsible for your emotions just as much as the person you're around is responsible for their emotions, again, that can reinstate this sense of autonomy. So that sort of goes back to point one, but there's that extra layer of giving responsibility for that emotional state to the person that you're around rather than taking responsibility for their emotions yourself. The next coping strategy that I would talk about here is I've termed it tactful authenticity. And I think this is really crucial because in any given relationship, you have to be willing to be honest. You have to be willing to be authentic about the things that you think and feel to the people around you. In the absence of authenticity, in the absence of honesty, relationships really become fake. They sort of become strained. And you end up having to hide parts of yourself, hide your thoughts and feelings, walk around eggshells on people. And this can really add to the frustration of being around somebody who has a who's going through mental or emotional struggles, where because out of consideration, of course, for what they're going through, you try to cut your own sense of emotion and your own sense of needs and wants and thoughts off completely. But you need to be willing to draw boundaries, and you need to be willing to be authentic and honest with the people around you in practically all circumstances. This doesn't mean to say that you need to constantly be harping up on what it is that you're feeling or thinking, but it means that you need to be willing to do that. That needs to be an option, right? You need to be free to do that, even if you don't execute that option. And it's important to be sort of truthful, I guess, when you're talking to somebody, right? So this kind of goes back to when we were talking about the distancing aspect. Whereas if you're around somebody who's going through something and it's affecting you, being able to be tactfully honest or authentic with that person by stating the truth, like, when I'm around you, I'm feeling this, this, and this. That can be really important for maintaining that level of authenticity within your relationship. And it's important in two ways. One, because it asserts within yourself that you are important too, right? That you are a human being with wants, needs, and feelings, not just the person who is going through the issue, and that you are also being affected by the circumstances of this person. At the same time, it allows this person to really be aware of how they're affecting the people around them. Now, this has to be done, as I mentioned before, sort of in a tactful way. It's not about going to somebody who's struggling with, emotional problems and it's causing you a lot of emotional distress because of this. It's not about going to them and saying, you're such a horrible person. Why can't you just get a hold of yourself and stop feeling bad about X, Y, and Z? Where you're talking about moralizing and blaming people, and you're angry with them, and you're sort of just projecting your own frustrations onto them instead of taking responsibility for your own emotions. This is about, calm, curious conversation with the person where you're saying, again, like I mentioned, hey, when I'm around you, I'm feeling X, Y, and Z. I think I need to do X, Y, and Z in order to deal with whatever is going on. That kind of conversation is perfectly okay, even if it is slightly uncomfortable for you and that person. Again, it gives you the sanity of saying, well, this is what I'm really dealing with, and being able to talk truthfully about that. And at the same time, it gives that person concrete information about how what they're going through is affecting the people around them, which can help to motivate them to make a change that might actually help them. But at the very least, it keeps the relationship authentic. It keeps the relationship honest. It keeps you from having to suppress yourself all the time and feeling as though you have to simply be an emotional object for this person that you're being around. The next coping strategy here is going to be self-care. This is important as a supplement, especially if you're going to choose to continue to be around a person who has emotional issues, whether to help them or because it's difficult not to be around them. Some kind of self-care is really important when it comes to coping with the circumstances, right? This is related to, in one sense, the degree of self-awareness, but awareness about the situation. And self-care can come in a number of ways. One, you can seek things which are actually, joyful and meaningful and happiness producing for you, that can act as a counter to sort of the negative emotional environment that you're in. But also just means of becoming more aware of yourself, of your past, and of the situation that you find yourself in, the dynamics in that, by trying to kind of seek objective perspectives and trying to concretely describe what it is that you're going through. And so the main methods would be therapy, journaling, and just seeking objective perspectives. Therapists deal with people who are going through emotional problems all the time. It's their job. And most therapists, they have a therapist so that they themselves can have an outlet in order to work through whatever the emotional situations that their patients are bringing up and be a better source of care and compassion to their patients. And in the same way, You're going to choose to be around a person who is going through emotional issues that are affecting you. Having a therapist as an outlet, or at least a close friend that you can talk to and who can give you some objective perspectives and maybe validate the kinds of things that you're thinking and feeling, can be an important foundation for dealing with the emotional environment, right? Giving you that cognitive distance between, what the person's going through and what you're feeling, where that feeling's coming through, whether it's about the present or about the past, these different kinds of things. Journaling can be crucial. That helps you to give a narrative to what's going on, to structure it, and then you can reflect back on it, days or months later and ask yourself, okay, how has the situation changed? How have my emotions changed in relationship to this person? How has my perspective of this person changed over time? Which can give you information about, sort of what to do next. And again, you can seek objective perspectives. You can talk to your friends. You can talk, if you have a pastor, you can talk to your pastor, people you trust, essentially. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about here is what I've called considering the limits of your tolerance, right? So everybody's got a limit. Everybody has a degree of emotional distress that they can tolerate for the sake of dealing with or being around or being in relationships with somebody who's going through something, right? And the problem for most people is that they get into the situation and the situation tests and tests and tests them. And at some point they sort of emotionally break and they have their own extreme reaction to the emotional stress of this person or the situation that they find themselves in, right? They never really consider what the line is for them. Like how many months, right, or a year, how many days or months or years or whatever are they going to be around this person and tolerate the kind of emotional distress that they experience as a result of it, right? And asking yourself and being forthright with yourself about what your tolerance is for being around this person can be crucial. Maybe your tolerance is a couple of hours. Maybe your tolerance is doing that for a couple of months, right? You can't necessarily get a strict answer, but even thinking about, okay, what's my line, right? What's my line for putting distance between myself and this person? Even just considering that can give you a guideline for what's going to count as distance. What's going to count as, okay, I need to put this on the shelf for a little while and take care of myself and get out of the situation because I can't, cope with it, right? What's the limit of your coping? If you've reached the limit of your coping, I would argue that not only do you have the right to leave that relationship, but in one sense, you have an obligation to leave it because if you're unable to cope with the emotional state of this person, you're not really going to be much help to them, right? You're just going to be emotionally reacting to them yourself. You're going to be in a bad mental state. You're going to start, exploding against this person or projecting onto them. You yourself are going to lose control and probably end up hurting that person more than whatever situation they already find themselves in, right? And the thing you want to do though is to think about that level of tolerance before you get to the breaking point, because then you can predict it, right? Then you can say, okay, this line has been crossed. I got to get out of here before things get worse, right? And people's limits of tolerance are going to be different. They're going to be subjective, but they should also be realistic, right? This is not an excuse to walk out the back door just because things get difficult. This is a realistic understanding of, okay, what can I tolerate? How much do I value this relationship or this person? And how much am I willing to put up with for the sake of this person? So that would be about 6 different coping strategies that you can use, sort of mindsets, general guidelines that you can use in order to attempt to cope with the dangers of being around somebody who is experiencing a poor mental state. I think particularly, again, recognizing your choice and autonomy in the situation is crucial for deciding on how you're going to act and for just getting that sense of liberation, because oftentimes the main driver of frustration in those kinds of relationships is the feeling like you're trapped, is the feeling like you have to be there or that you owe something to this person whom you're with. But the truth is that you simply don't. You have to take a realistic understanding of how do you value this relationship and how much are you willing to put up with for the sake of that relationship and helping this person, and to give them responsibility for your emotions and to take responsibility for your own emotions by recognizing your own autonomy. Now, I'm going to mention 2 special cases, 2 voluntary relationships, special cases where my personal opinion diverts from what I've been talking about above. And the first special case is going to be marriage. This is kind of a view I had even before I was a Christian, but becoming a Christian has further deepened this conviction of mine. And it's just important for me to point out that this is a personal conviction and, in one sense, a faith-based conviction. It's not necessarily the way that everybody views marriage, but this is the way that I view marriage. And the personal view here is that marriage in particular is a specifically higher commitment to the person than you would find in something like a friendship or, boyfriend-girlfriend situation or a family member even. And this is because this is what I think the purpose of marriage is. The purpose of marriage is to essentially say to a person that no matter what happens between us, I am committed to you as an individual, right? And whether sickness or health, poor or in wealth, I'm going to be there to support and love and care for you. Right. And it's such a special and important commitment because everybody knows that everybody is fallen, right? Everybody is, in one sense or another, broken and imperfect. And so in a relationship, it's not a question of if you're going to upset your partner or if you're going to do the wrong thing or if you're going to make mistakes and betray trust and these different kinds of things, different kinds of degrees, obviously. My point is to say, it's not a question of if you're going to cause problems for your partner. It's a recognition that you are going to cause problems for your partner because you're imperfect and your partner is going to do the same thing to you. But despite the difficulties that you cause for each other, you are still going to be on each other's team, support each other, and love each other no matter what. And so that's a special kind of commitment, and it's a special kind of relationship because of that commitment. I think a lot of times people enter into marriage and think of it almost like just a different name for the same kind of relationship that they were having before, right? When they were boyfriend-girlfriend, now they're husband and a wife, and really they just changed names, but the dynamics are the same, right? But again, in my view, I think that marriage is a particular higher commitment to this kind of person, which means a higher tolerance for their crap, basically, right? A higher tolerance for their imperfection. And a deeper willingness to be there to love and support them, even though they make mistakes or they're imperfect or they hurt you. There are some caveats to this, right? The one is that marriage is really supposed to be something that is done alongside a community or community support. I see some people getting into relationships and getting married where they don't have a connection to their family, or they don't have a connection to a church, or they don't have a connection to, a large friend group or some sort of community that they can lean on in times of personal distress with their marriage. But really, a successful marriage is done within the context of a community. And the reason why is because your partner is going to fail you, right? Your partner is going to be imperfect, but you still want to have this level of commitment, have this level of tolerance, have this level of love and care for them, even if you go through difficulties, even if you go through big difficulties. And part of what allows that kind of commitment to be successful is that you can lean on your community in one extent or another, right? You can lean on your family, you can lean on your church, you can lean on the people around you to give both of you advice and support and care, right? So it's not just one person bearing the entire burden of their partner who is going through something. Rather, that person has an outlet for objective perspectives, for a place where they can receive love and care, where they can receive support, sort of be built up, and then they can kind of go back and figure those things out with their partner, and vice versa. Marriage is meant to be done in something like a community, and oftentimes the greatest emotional toxicities that come about in marriage relationships, are because the couples are, in one sense, isolated. They don't have a close connection to the family where they can reach out, or they don't have a community that they are around who can perceive problems or whom they can lean on. Marriage is meant to be done in the context of community support, and that for the sake of this higher kind of commitment, this higher kind of tolerance for this person who you are ideally meant to live with for the rest of your life. But the second big caveat there, of course, is any cases of abuse. So, if you are in a marriage and there's any kind of physical, verbal or emotional abuse, you have to distance yourself and seek help, right? This is the other reason why community is so important in relationship to marriage. If you are experiencing any kind of abuse within a marriage, it's no longer about tolerance. It's no longer about this higher commitment. Your other partner has already violated this to such a degree that you need to go seek community and distance from that person. You need to get yourself out of the situation, get help, get perspective, and then reevaluate what you want to do in that situation in regards to your partner's abuse. The idea of marriage as a higher commitment and a higher tolerance for the difficulties that come with living is not an excuse for any kind of abuse, whether that's physical, verbal, or emotional. And that's really, really crucial to keep in mind in any of these, in the case of marriage. The second special case that I'm going to talk about here is the parent's relationship to the child. This is another case in which the commitment and the tolerance of emotional difficulties ought to be significantly higher for the parent in relationship to the child. And this is because the parent is responsible for the child, not only responsible for the child's emotional state, their success in life, the resources that they need in order to develop into a healthy adult, but because the relationship is chosen. I mean, the parent chooses to have the child, brings the child into the world, and becomes responsible for the life and the health and the emotional state of the care of their child. And that kind of choice and responsibility comes with that much higher tolerance for their emotional states and much more responsibility for their emotional states in order to help them. I think this extends to a lifetime, even when they're adults, that this kind of tolerance extends, this kind of responsibility, care, and tolerance extends for a lifetime. But again, this is meant to be done in the context of a community. You know, and they say it takes a village to raise a child. And this is an important context when it relates to the parent's relationship to the child. Ideally, and I know this is not the case for everybody, but ideally, you want to have some sort of external community that you can rely on. I think church is a great outlet for this, but some sort of external community that you can rely on when you're facing difficulties, emotional difficulties with your child, right? Because it's hard, if not impossible, to try to do all of that on your own. You need your own care system, your own care support. You need people whom you can lean on for support in relationship to caring for a child, even if it is your responsibility and even if it was chosen, because nonetheless it's difficult. And then again, just to highlight this, in cases of abuse, if your child in some way, sometimes this happens with teenagers, if your child is in some way physically, emotionally, or verbally abusing you, you need to distance yourself in the ways that you can and seek help to rectify that abuse. Any person's mental state is not an excuse for abuse. And so if your adult children or your teenage children are in any way abusing you, then you need to seek distance from them and also seek some sort of professional help in order to deal with whatever abuse is going on there. But I wanted to end on this special case of the parent-child relationship because it relates to the involuntary relationships that I'm going to be talking about here in a minute, but sort of the reverse, right? So instead of talking about the parent's relationship to the child, I want to talk about the child's relationship to the parent, because this is probably the biggest and most crucial involuntary relationship that I can think of that is really commonplace. And the ways, both the problems and the ways of coping with it are significantly different. So the child to parent relationship is, again, the reversed relationship of the parent-to-child relationship. And principally because there's such a great imbalance of power between them. In the first place, the child never chooses the parent. The child comes into the world because the parent chose them. And the child from the beginning has absolutely no power and no autonomy over themselves or their life. They are completely dependent on their parents for love, for care, for the resources that they need, for their education, for their clothes, for the roof over their head, for food, all of it. Every single thing that a child has, they get from their caretakers, their parents. And so there is a massive imbalance of power there. And some parents, unfortunately, to one degree or another, exploit this power imbalance for themselves. Not always consciously, though a lot of times it does happen, but this same kind of emotional reproduction that can happen is that I talked about before can happen in a very perverse way when the power imbalance between the child and the parent is exploited. Parents, of course, are not perfect creatures, right? They are their own bundles of traumatic responses, frustrations, and problems with dealing with life. And it is easy, if the parent is not aware of it, for them to use their children as sort of an emotional outlet in one degree or another, either as a substitute caretaker, either as somebody who will listen to them talk about their problems, as someone whom they can just be forthrightly depressed and anxious around because the child will just conform themselves. I mean, for example, if you have a mother who is chronically depressed when you're a child, oftentimes children's experience is that they have to, in one way or another, shut themselves down. They can't talk, the child can't talk about their problems. The child can't have emotions. The child can't talk about their thoughts. Their child can't talk about what they're experiencing in terms of their mother's depression, because if the child talks about that, that could set the mother off, right? Same thing with a father who is really angry, right? And he yells all the time, for example. The child ends up having to walk around eggshells and hide themselves and subvert their own self-development around their father because they don't know when the next time their father is going to be angry. But in the case of an adult, if you're in a situation like that as an adult, you can leave, right? You can leave, and you're not dependent on this person to provide you everything that you need or to love you. But for the child, if they're in a situation like that, they have no power to leave. They can't physically leave. They need their parents for their own survival. And more than that, they want the love and the care of their parents. And so the child has to just simply cope with it. The child simply has to become whatever emotional object that the parents need them to be. And children readily do this for their parents all the time when this kind of thing happens. And the truth of the matter is that there is not really strategies that you can give the child to sort of cope with the situation, because the child is almost completely powerless in a situation like that. The child will simply have to suffer and endure unless an adult from the outside perceives what is going on and intervenes in some sort of way. But how this relates to what we're talking about is that, many adults, many child now adults who have experienced this in one degree or another, maybe not as extreme as, the father who's yelling at you all the time, or the parent who is chronically depressed, but many people have these kinds of experiences as children, had to deal with them, had their personality and the way they understand themselves molded around that kind of experience, and now as an adult, they carry that with them in an unconscious way. So if you're a child who has to shut yourself down around an angry father or a depressed mother, and you never really develop an authentic conception of yourself because you're not allowed to express what you really think and feel and experience, then as an adult, you can carry that into adulthood, into the present situation. And now the very act of being alone with your own thoughts can provoke fear, right? Because that in the past, that might have led to you saying something that could get you in trouble, could get you yelled at, or could set your mother off the edge, right? So you can bring this kind of inauthenticity into your adulthood, which can really cripple your adult sense of vitality and of meaning and what you want to be and what brings you happiness. It can really cut off your sense of self. And by the way, this kind of imbalance of power doesn't just apply necessarily to little children. This can apply to teenagers as well, not only because teenagers are also dependent on their parents in a number of ways, and that power can be exploited by the parents, but because they've been trained their entire life by their parents to sort of be emotionally compliant in the ways that their parents need. So this can also happen for teenagers. And actually, it often does. Much of what is called teenage rebellion is really just unprocessed and unexpressed anger and frustration with their parents' own kind of hypocrisy or the things that they've been subjected to as a kid, but they're a teenager and they haven't learned how to articulate that, or maybe articulating it deliberately to the parents would, cause their parents to do some, or would make their parents kick them out or hurt them in some way. I mean, situations like that happen. So the same kind of power imbalance, not as extremely, but the physical power imbalance gets more equal, but the mental power, the psychological power imbalance between a teenager and their parents can be just as skewed. And so in terms of ways that, again, the child can't really avoid this, right? If the child is suffering this and no adult comes to intervene in the situation, then unfortunately the child just suffers. This is part of the reason why we should be perceptive about how children are being treated by the adults around us, because we want to be aware of situations where we could intervene, or we could seek somebody who could intervene in a really helpful way, right? But in terms of the problems of adults carrying the experiences of this from their childhood into their adulthood, there are a couple things that you can do to deal with the involuntary relationship of the past, your relationship as a child to an adult. And I'll try to do these briefly. The first thing is to be conscious of your past through things like therapy and journaling and seeking outside of perspectives. Kind of the same theme that we brought in the first part when we were talking about voluntary relationships. The more that you can become aware of your past, the better off you're going to be. Part of this is just, writing an autobiography, right? Is trying to go over from the earliest memory that you can think of and talk about maybe the major events of your life and how you feel and how you thought. This has a twofold advantage of giving you information about your past, but also allowing you to maybe for the first time authentically express your thoughts and feelings in a private way about what happened to you in your past. Therapy is a good place of doing this too. You can talk to somebody, you can talk to a therapist about your thoughts and feelings about your past, about what's going on for you there, and they can kind of give you that space to be able to do that where you're not going to be threatened and it's not dangerous. And that'll actually reteach you to feel secure in sort of being authentic around a person, which can be very liberating. The third strategy there would be getting objective sources. So one of the things that I did when I was going through something like this is I actually called a lot of my family members and I simply asked them the question, what was your childhood like and how did you experience being around me as a child? And just by asking them the question and not fighting them on anything, right? Just getting their perspectives on what happened to you as a child and what their childhoods would like can really give you a good narrative of your past. Oftentimes we don't reach beyond our own immediate past, but a lot of times the reasons for the things that happen to us as children are in the childhoods of our parents, our uncles, our cousins, etc. And not only that, but they can kind of give you different perspectives on yourself. And if you can kind of strain what is collectively agreed upon there, you can get a good reconstruction of what your past is really like. Treat it with a little bit of skepticism because they might have their own psychological interests involved there. They might want to be telling their own story, but it's a good source of information about your past. And the next step to that would be trying to separate the past from the present. We talked about this a little bit in the first section, but when you're around somebody and they do something, they say something, they're feeling a certain way, that seems to trigger this response in you that almost seems exaggerated, right? If you just looked at the objective facts of the situation, your emotion, whatever emotion you're having, just seems outside of proportion to whatever situation you find yourself in. Oftentimes that's coming about because a past feeling is now being projected onto the present, right? So if you had to walk around eggshells around your father because when he got angry, you would have to shut yourself down. If somebody takes a tone with you that is maybe slightly disapproving, and that tone makes you feel really frustrated, really constrained, and really angry at that person, that might itself be a reaction to a childhood experience, and you're sort of projecting your childhood experience of your father onto this person who has taken a more firm tone with you, for whatever reason, and asking yourself, okay, when an emotion comes up or a state of mind comes up, asking yourself, okay, where's this coming from? Does this fit the present situation, right? Does this fit what I'm really thinking about, or does does it fit my past more, right? This is why getting information about your past is really important, because that information allows you to see where your emotions are coming from. And that allows you to sort of cognitively dissociate it, right? You can say, oh, this is about the past, not about the present. The present actually isn't depressing or anxiety inducing or rage inducing, right? Maybe my childhood was, or maybe this past situation was, but my present isn't. So, you can examine that in terms of the past context. That can help you to let it go there so that it doesn't continue to show up in your present experience. The next thing I would encourage is just general authenticity to people around you. Again, in some, tactful way, being able to express your being open about your emotions, your thoughts, and your feelings is really crucial. But especially it's crucial towards your parents. Now, depending on what your childhood situation was like, this is not always possible. But if you have the opportunity to be honest with your parents about your thoughts and feelings about how you were raised, which can be a difficult conversation. It can be a difficult conversation for you and for them, but it's worth it. I've done this myself. It's well worth it, because oftentimes the biggest block that we have to being authentic about who we are, our thoughts and feelings, emotions, which gives us vitality in life. Often the reason we struggle so much with being authentic is because we haven't done this with our parents. For whatever reason, because of the circumstances of childhood, you were unable to be authentic with them. Maybe they incentivized you not to be authentic with them, or they punished you if you expressed your thoughts and emotions. Whatever the case may be, as an adult with, your independence and your own, sort of newfound adult power, you can go to your parents and say, hey, when I was a child, this is how I felt being raised. This event and this event and this event happened, and that caused me a lot of pain and suffering, or whatever, right? And you can describe it to them, and they'll probably have one of two reactions to it, right? They'll either tell you, no, that didn't happen. They'll dismiss what you're saying. They'll downplay your emotions and your feelings. In which case, they're not really incentivized to understand what you're really feeling there, right? Or else they'll be curious, which is the response you want to hope for, right? When you say, when I was a child, I felt like I had to walk on eggshells around you because you were angry. A parent who is interested in figuring that out with you will say something like, okay, well, I'm curious about that. Tell me more about this, right? And they will be willing to explore your childhood with you, just like your friend would, just like a therapist would. They will take that position of curiosity with you and be open to whatever you thought and experienced, because it doesn't sort of threaten their own sense of self, right? But some parents are going to react negatively with gaslighting or with accusations or with anger or something like that. And this mostly has to do with the fact that they feel as though you are threatening their own self-conception of themselves, either as good parents or whatever. And that has more to do with their own being caught up in their own image of themselves, and it has to do with being curious about what their child experienced as a child and how it's affecting them. So you might experience either curiosity or rage, basically trying to distance themselves from what you're saying in one way or another. But regardless of the reaction that you get from them, it can be liberating to speak the truth, right? Because it gives you that sense of self, and it shows yourself that, hey, I can be authentic around my parents, and it's not going to blow up in my face. I'm not going to die. Like, maybe it's difficult, but, I'm an adult and I can take care of myself. I don't need my parents. And so I can be authentic around them. That can be incredibly liberating for a person who has gone through something like this. And then, of course, the last strategy with this is, again, distancing, right? This is not necessarily cutting off relationships. There are definitely extreme cases of abuse or harm where it is in the child, now adult's, best interest to cut this parent off and to not talk to them. Again, this is not a chosen relationship. You don't have any obligation to be around this person. Even in a chosen relationship, you don't have an obligation to be around the person. So specifically in the child's relationship to the parent, they don't have a obligation to be around the parent or provide for the parent or love the parent or do anything for the parent, because the relationship in and of itself isn't chosen at all. But at the same time, most children have some kind of affection for their parents, right? And it's not like you want to be without that relationship. So distance can be a good middle ground here, where, you just tell your parents, hey, I feel as though I can't be authentic around you. I feel as though I've been suffering through these things. I'd like to figure some stuff out. I'd like to go to therapy. I'd like to journal. I'd like to have some space to myself to, figure out whatever I need to figure out. And so I'm going to take some temporary distance from you in order to do that. Right. And they ought to respect that request from you. So anyway, guys, that's where we're going to end on this question. How does someone's poor mental state affect the people around them, and how can those people cope with it? I hope that I was able to, give this viewer a comprehensive as possible answer to that question. I hope that this was useful to them. But what are your guys' thoughts? Do you think that I've hit the nail on the head here? Do you think that I've gotten this right, or do you think that there are areas in which it can be improved or completely changed? Did you get any value out of this? But if you like it, then I would encourage you to hit the like button. If you think that somebody else would get some value out of this, then I would encourage you to share this with them. And if you would like to see more videos like this, then please hit that subscribe button. And thank you guys for listening, as always.